Welcome to today's Global Government Forum webinar, looking at the future of the office in the public sector. My name is Richard Johnson, and I'm the Executive Editor of Global Government Forum, which is a website and publishing company focused on bringing together public and civil servants from around the world, and indeed in the UK in this instance, to share best practice. And we're delighted to be joined by Asana as the knowledge partner for today's webinar. And it's a webinar on what I think is a very interesting and pertinent topic of the future of the office in the public sector. It's a topic that's very newsworthy at the moment because the coronavirus pandemic had a large effect on many aspects of the public sector, and kind of chief amongst them was the office and where civil servants worked. Many government services, of course, were moved online in a matter of days, and many governments, including the UK, worked very hard and very fast to set up remote working for officials during the pandemic. And civil servants managed to keep services going during those very high pressure peaks of COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021. And as restrictions ebbed and flowed, many continued to work from home. Now, with all restrictions lifted in the UK, at least, many officials still do, having found that remote and flexible working helps them maintain a better work-life balance and even to work more efficiently. But as I'm sure almost everybody joining us on the call has noted, the newspapers are always full of government ministers calling civil servants to come back into the offices, praising the collaborative environment that the office provides. So this really is a fascinating moment to think about what do government departments and agencies need from their office estate. Many government departments had already, long before the pandemic, moved away from traditional rows and rows of officials sitting at desks into hot desking environments and more collaborative spaces. But many now are thinking again about what the office is for post-COVID and how to use the estate that they have to deliver the most efficient and effective public services. And I should say, just by way of introductory comment, that COVID-19, of course, is not the only thing that's leading to this kind of change. For nearly a decade, the UK central and local governments have worked together on the One Public Estate programme, which has been focused on co-locating local and national offices together to both encourage collaboration and free up surplus land. And post-COVID, estate plans also come as the government remains committed to moving 22,000 civil servants out of London and the southeast around the country, with the result that many government departments are looking for office space in new locations. So as I say, it's such an interesting time to look at the future of the public sector estate, and we've got a great panel with us today to do just that. But before I introduce them, I also want to invite you to get involved and to put a question or any comments to our panel. What do you think are the benefits of office co-location? Can it improve public services and help join up provision? Do you think that public sector organisations need to plan now for the hybrid future? And if so, what do they need to consider? And are there savings that can be unlocked from the better use of public sector buildings? Please get in touch with any questions throughout the session using the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will share as much of them with the panel as we can. So to the panel, I shall introduce them quickly. First up, we have Michael Odokerty, the Project Director from Local Partnerships. Michael joined Local Partnerships in January 2020, and prior to that he held several senior roles in housing, local and central government over 25 years, including Assistant Director of Housing at Manchester City Council, Assistant Director at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and Regional Programme Manager for the Cabinet Office One Public Estate Programme that I mentioned earlier. So thank you, Michael, for joining us. We are also joined today by Meredith May, the Deputy Director of Real Estate Strategy in the Portfolio and Leasehold Division of the Department for Work and Pensions. Meredith joined DWP in January 2020. after leaving Well Pharmacy, where she had worked as head of property for 5 years. As the head of real estate strategy at the DWP, Meredith plays a central part in ensuring the alignment of the estate strategy with business need as we return to the new normal post-COVID. And it will be good to get an idea from Meredith what she thinks that new normal is. Meredith and her team are focused on new ways of working and how that will indeed impact the strategic direction of the estate. So it's great to have Meredith with us today. We are also joined today by Natasha Harris, the Deputy Director, Inclusion and Smarter Working at HMRC. Natasha works as part of the Transforming the Way We Work team in HMRC, which provides organisational direction on hybrid and smarter working. Natasha also has more than 20 years experience working in public and private sector organisations, developing and implementing HR strategies that improve the overall employee experience, as well as positively impacting organisational performance. So hello, Natasha, it's great to have you here too. And last but by no means least, we're joined by Ben Crowe, the head of EMEA Revenue Partnerships at Asana. Asana is a work management platform that enables teams, no matter where they are, to collaborate on tasks, projects, and initiatives, and for individuals to get clarity on their work so that they know who is doing what and by when. And Ben leads the partner program across EMEA for Asana. So it's, again, very pertinent to this kind of conversation. So welcome, Ben. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to provide some opening thoughts on the topic today. So I'm going to ask Michael to speak first. Michael.
Thanks, Richard, and afternoon, everybody. So it's great to be here, by the way. I'm going to talk a little bit about one public estate in particular, and then how we think it might be relevant going forward into the post-COVID world, particularly in relation to town centres and the levelling up agenda. As Richard said, I work for an organisation called Local Partnerships. We're owned by the Treasury, by the LGA and by the Welsh Government, and we work kind of public to public. I'm part of a team that looks at housing regeneration and property. And we also do a lot of work, as we're doing at the moment, supporting DLUC on assessing levelling up applications. So it's quite interesting to see the role of public buildings, town centres as part of those applications as well. So we can touch on that maybe a little bit later. So I suppose my main experience in relation to this agenda was 4 years as a programme manager for one public estate. And as Richard's already said, it's collaboration between the Cabinet Office, the LGA, and more recently, DLUC provide funding for that as well. I think importantly, and maybe slightly different from the main kind of thrust of today's discussions, it's about working across all public sectors, so local authorities, government departments, blue light, health, etc. So it was about bringing all those partners together. It started in 2013. I think we thought it was going to be for a few years. It's still going, and now we have over 95% of local authorities brought together in a number of regional partnerships. It brings together funding, revenue funding, but also capital funding in terms of brownfield land release funding for releasing land for housing. And its main thrust is around economic growth, particularly that land for housing, creating jobs, particularly around customer focused services. And that's, as Richard already said, looking at collaboration, co-location, transformation. So there's a lot of push, not just on the buildings, but on the services and the way of working from within those. And then also in terms of generating efficiencies, whether they're running cost savings, smaller buildings, or efficient shared costs or capital receipts from disposal of land. In terms of the basics, and I assume quite a number of people will know how OPE works, so I won't go into too much detail, but what's important, and I think what's relevant going forward, is that OPE has a kind of a arena where a number of public sector partners can be brought together, usually with a leadership, a chair who's a chief executive of one of the organisations, and a strategic lead overseeing that is the important aspect as well. But we found that asset mapping and workshops to understand where each organisation is on their journey in terms of operating model, and obviously post-COVID, that's going to be crucially important. and looking at their estate and their future use of their estate. And I know other speakers after me will go into a little bit more detail about how you do that. Ultimately, for all organisations, it's that question is, what do we need now in terms of buildings, offices and space? What do we need in the future? What else could we do with that building? Could we release it, or do we hold it and maybe do something more innovative with it and get a lease or rental income? When you bring all those partners together, directors of property, and ask those questions, that's when you start to get ideas about potentially quite innovative projects, public service hubs. We've seen blue light kind of shared services, etc. So it can be really quite a vibrant place where you get those ideas brought together. And what OPE does, it helps to de-risk some of the, I suppose, the costs in terms of time and staffing for doing that work up front. Just a little bit in terms of the challenges, and I think again this will link back into some of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later. Clearly you need a number of organisations that are in the same place in terms of their priorities, whether that's about maximising the use of the buildings, reducing costs, but sometimes you might find that some organisations are trying to maximise income from disposal, and that might not work if, for example, other organisations are trying to release land for affordable housing. It'd be interesting to hear from Meredith and Natasha about how they, in their disposal and their estate strategies, align with OPE and the wider kind of opportunities that can bring, but can also sometimes be a distraction if you've got a really clear target to release a certain amount of property, for example. Different timelines, so some buildings you might have a lease renewal coming up, so you need to do something with it quite quickly. Other organisations might not be working at the same speed, that can slow things down. And ultimately it's about the relationship between different organisations. So sometimes you have say unitarisation, it can create some challenges within those authorities, and it might be more difficult to get work to happen at that time. I think the challenge across all the public sector right now is going to be around capacity, skills, and just opportunity cost of doing other things. So actually having people do this work, thinking about that with not clarity yet in terms of what the future operating model is in some cases, it's a difficult time to do some of this work. I suppose for me, the other aspect of one public estate that is improving, but has traditionally not been the strongest, is around net zero and low carbon. It makes sense to absolutely bring your public buildings, your building assets into your net zero strategy and understand how you can reduce your carbon emissions as part of that work. And OPE has a role to play, I think, in working alongside that. Other challenges include things like different IT systems, digital security, and understanding the various costs of collaboration, co-location, hot desking. Sometimes it can be difficult to really understand what those costs are. I think I'm probably about to run out of time. I mean, I was going to touch on town centre regeneration. I know we'll come back into this, but I think this, for me, OP has got a huge role that they can play in terms of, particularly where you've got public buildings within town centre, opportunities to do some of the things I've already talked about, but in the space of maybe place shaping, regenerating those areas that are failing, consolidating down a number of public sector buildings into one or two, and looking at aligning that to levelling up bids as well. So probably that's my time, Richard. I'm sure we'll come back onto some of these to show us the remainder.
Excellent, absolutely sure we will. Michael, thank you very much for setting that out. I think that's a really good overview of some of the opportunities and perhaps challenges that come from trying to get public sector organisations to collaborate together on office space and estate. And yes, please do get in touch if you are watching along and you have some thoughts on whether that, how to make that work and what the kind of benefits that either that you've seen from it could be, or that you think could be unlocked in future. I'm going to go to Meredith next to set out some reflections from the DWP. Meredith.
Thanks, Richard. Afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm going to sort of give a little bit of a look back and then where we find ourselves now from a DWP perspective. Like Michael, it seems we both joined our new jobs in January 2022. Obviously, the time to join. Little did we know then what was coming down the track. But yeah, when I joined the department, it was quite an old-fashioned way of working, I would say, certainly from where I'd come from. People were in 5 days a week. Many had no ability to work from home whatsoever. They didn't have IT kit, and effectively culture demanded that people were in the office most of the time, if not all of the time, or their working time. And only in our sort of corporate centres were we using sort of ratios of hybrid working or hot desking, and even at that time it was 8 people to 10 desks, so not really pushing the envelope in terms of using our space in that mixed model. But even with that much space being used, we still had so much space as a department, and my team were looking at how we could rationalise the estate, reduce and move things forward. But then obviously March 2020 happened, the world went sideways, and we basically had to send our office population home. So people who had been wholly reliant on being in the office in order to do their jobs were now at home. And I think Richard touched on it in the introduction, the then amazing rollout by the teams to effectively get people able to work from home ensued. Now, we did have people working in the office throughout COVID. Some of our members of staff cannot work from home, so we had to make sure they had somewhere to work. I think we were one of the highest occupiers through COVID, which meant we endured all of the fabulous restrictions, policies, checkerboard systems, fresh air into the aircon, etc., that needed to be done to ensure that we could have people in the office, but obviously at a much lower level than we did pre-pandemic. And I am mainly going to focus on I am only going to focus on our back of house portfolio, so our traditional offices, but it does sound like me and Michael could have a good conversation about our front of house estate, certainly, where we've done a lot of OPE collaboration, and I think there's a lot more we could probably do in that space. So one for another day, I think, but something to go there. So I suppose what now? So I think it's fair to say we're never going to go back into the office 5 days a week. I think everybody has accepted that. And people are naturally starting to think about how they use the office and home working in a way that works for them. So today I'm obviously sat at home because I knew I was doing this call. I had a number of calls earlier on, and I didn't want the awkward somebody knocking on the meeting room door that you've booked and trying to move around. But next week, I know I'm in the office 3 days. I've got numerous meetings with my team, with people across government, with some external suppliers, etc. And I'm not alone in that. I think a lot of people are naturally starting to look at how they use the office in multiple ways. It's really important, particularly for the public estate, that we do not have buildings sitting half empty. All occupiers will be looking at their space that isn't being used well, but we do have a responsibility to the public purse. So having offices that are not being utilised is something we need to resolve, and obviously that is one of the reasons we get all the headlines that we discussed at the start of the call. The way we need to do that is to ensure that we have an estate that is right-sized, provides quality accommodation that meets the needs of the people who are going to be using it. And I would add that it supports the green agenda as something we need to shift forward. And both the government strategy, property strategy, and the DWP estate strategy have carefully called that smaller, better, greener. And I think that links well with what we want to see going forward. So we've embarked on a workplace transformation programme, which is picking up where we left off in 2020, but it's going to go further because of the hybrid model, because that means that we'll need even less space. So this year we will be exiting a significant amount of estate, mainly taking advantage of lease breaks and expiries. And if it all goes to plan, we'll have exited around 200,000 square metres of office space by March 23. I had to check that figure a few times because I was nervous, but it's a big figure and it is correct. In most cases, that is going to involve moving to one site in a locality. So moving people from several locations into one. We're going to have a lot more headcount pointed at a single site. That will mean the ratios have significantly increased of how many people are pointing at a building, but we're trying to move away from desk ratios to workspace ratios as we move to those different ways of working. People are willing to travel further, as they're not required to be in the office every day. But we'll only make a success of this if we attract a cultural change, because just working as we always have, less in the office, is not going to work, and it's not going to benefit us or the public estate. So we hear a lot about collaboration. I think it's already been mentioned a few times on the call today. It is clear that people enjoy being in the office. They benefit coming together, going through issues, training, etc. And the famous water cooler moments, which we have not managed to do digitally. Nobody's managed to sort that one out, I don't think. But we have to accept that not everyone's role is in the office. And we're asking people to adapt at the moment, certainly in DWP, but other places as well, in an environment that has not yet been transformed. So we're asking them to collaborate, but in a place that is fitted out with banks of desks. It doesn't have collaboration space. It doesn't have touchdown space. It doesn't have lockers. And I think it seems universally acknowledged that lockers are the golden egg to sort out hybrid working and flexibility. Whether that's true is yet to be seen. We may end up with office box full of lockers if we're not too careful. But to do that and to move down, we will need to look at occupancy management, because if we move into ratios, we will need to make sure that people are not all turning up on a Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday and offices are empty Monday and Friday. But how do we do that when we're still trying to create a flexible approach and not dictate and prescribe to people when they need to be in the office? So that's another trick that we're still looking for answers for. Looking forward to seeing if there's any tips later on in the call from colleagues, but yeah, we're not there yet. So in the short term, we're certainly doing a lot of trials. We're trying to establish how our office should be configured and what works. We've started a number of these already. Interestingly, when I go to some spaces where we've got fabulous collaboration space and a traditional office setup, people are sitting in the traditional office setup and the collaboration space is not used. But that's because the culture hasn't been embraced yet. And that, I think, is the key point for how we're going to do this together. So I think coming together for training, team building, problem solving is definitely something that we've seen a benefit of being in a physical environment together. I think we see that as a long way to come. Until we can, I think I said, a true metaverse approach to how we can collaborate. I think having physical spaces in the right place, at the right size, for the right purpose is key. Exactly what that looks like is TBC, I think. And I think my time is probably up there as well, Richard, so I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Meredith. That's really interesting to hear where the DWP is getting to on these kind of thought processes, given the size of the estate and the number of employees that we're talking about. I think once we get into the question and answers, I want to dig into some of that information a little bit more. But before we get to Q&A, I'm going to invite Natasha to share her thoughts from HMRC perspective.
Thank you, Richard. And lots of synergies with what Meredith was describing as another government department. And actually, we are co-located, our departments in some of our government hubs. But let me just take you on a bit of a journey, actually. So back in 2015, HMRC had already been grappling in the years before with our location strategy, with more than 100 offices up and down the country. A number of things were contributing to the kind of need to modernise our estate and to think about how we wanted to kind of work in the future and how we were going to utilise our office spaces. But more recently, the government's kind of programme around places for growth and creating opportunities and career pathways in towns and cities across the UK has absolutely aligned with and enabled us to really propel forward. So HMRC, as I said, already had a significant ambition way beyond the period where we found ourselves in a couple of years ago. We now have a substantial presence in all regions and devolved nations of the UK. So we've opened 12 regional centres up and down the country, from Belfast, here in Birmingham where I am today, Cardiff, Croydon, Leeds and Manchester, just to name some of them. We're also expecting to move some of our biggest office footprint in Newcastle to its new hub location in 2027. And these new hubs that I described, they are government hubs, provide modern and inclusive workspaces that provide the type of high-speed digital infrastructure you would expect in a modern office. And so we've very much been building an estate that we believe is an estate for the future. But of course, that was pre-pandemic and even our ambitions around smarter working across government. So what we know is that we're learning more about how colleagues are using the spaces that are available to them in our new regional centres. And similarly to Meredith, we are trialling and adapting to that. So in some of our newer regional centres, we've been able to think about the kind of balance between desk space versus spaces that are available for colleagues to collaborate or to work in different ways. So we continue to find new ways and new opportunities to kind of maximise the estate. One of the significant ways we have been doing that is actually by working across government, working with other government departments, finding opportunities to actually let some of the space. So where we've needed less space in our regional centres kind of post the pandemic, we have been able to date, we've leased around 45,000 square metres of space in our regional centres to around 38 other government departments, which is a significant undertaking. And that has meant that we've accommodated around 10,000 employees within our continue to open regional centres. Where I'm sitting now in Birmingham, we opened this regional centre back in October of last year. And it's only in the last number of months that we've been able to really start to maximise the opportunity working here. Whilst we were in the pandemic, we did work with the organisation and established principles for hybrid working. So how would individuals, how would teams best work out new ways of working? We developed a range of tools for managers and leaders in navigating that as well. And we set an expectation for the number of days, as a number of organisations have done, for office working. And we are continually needing to listen to feedback. Our focus now is very much, and again, hearing this from other organisations and other government departments, is being really clear and consistent across a workforce of more than 60,000 people around the purpose of our offices. So we still have, it's a small percentage of our colleagues, but we still have a percentage of colleagues who have not yet returned. And we also have a percentage of colleagues who are not yet working in the way that we want them to in the future. And so there's much for us to learn in terms of the kind of employee sentiment. But also there's more for us to do in terms of building what we're describing as the office value proposition. So what value does it bring? All of the things that Meredith described are the types of things and the opportunities that when colleagues are coming in and are collaborating together, they speak very positively around. But there's certainly some more work to do for that to be consistently felt across the organisation. The second thing we're really focused on is building regional communities. So our ambition around being a great place to work and the various strands of work that we have around that are largely centred around the experiences we can create for our colleagues within our regions. And we know that by bringing people together within our regions and colleagues understanding the opportunities that are available to them, the career opportunities that are available to them within their region is also a really important kind of underlying tenet around that as well. The third area that we're focused around is matching task to space. So colleagues we recognise that there's a significant adjustment that colleagues are making in having to work out actually how they embed new working practices essentially. We all have become very accustomed to working in the way that we have for the last few years. So working out those new practices, really being informed about the range of workspaces that are available to colleagues when they are coming into the office. And as I say, really thinking about and planning the time, the way in which time is spent when colleagues are in offices, we think is going to be really critical to helping us to move forward. The final area that we're really focused on is an area that we are not unfamiliar with across government around smarter working. So our ambition to be a mature smarter working organisation remains. We're really clear that we've still got some way to go, and a number of government departments are still going through their PAS 3000 assessments, and we've been through ours fairly recently. So we'll get some really valuable insight in terms of the areas that we still need to focus in on. And smarter working always challenged us to think about where the work activity needed to be undertaken. But actually, we have been propelled into a space where colleagues now are experiencing much more flexibility than they ever have. But we haven't necessarily created all of the infrastructure around smarter working that we would and could do. One of the areas that we have certainly progressed with, I was smiling when Meredith was talking about lockers. So we've moved to a way of working where actually people moving around the office throughout the day have actually got spaces and places to be able to kind of house their belongings. But we know that there's a range of other things we need to think about in terms of helping our colleagues to work in the smartest way possible. So as I say, we've taken the opportunity already to collaborate with other government departments, thinking about how we save space. We know that there are more opportunities around that. There are potential additional savings through the way in which we move through various kind of contracts in different parts of our estate as well. So we're definitely exploiting that. And we've got a locations programme that not only continues to implement the regional centres, but really considers the types of working environments that enable us to recruit and retain the capability that we need now and into the future. So that's hopefully gives a bit of a flavour of where we're at HMRC at the moment, but look forward to taking some questions.
Really interesting to hear where HMRC is on this process, and apologies, I think my Zoom froze during the middle of that, so I hope I didn't interrupt when I was trying to rescue it, but yeah, I am back now. But thank you very much, Natasha. That was really interesting, and we are getting lots of questions in, and so we will get to those very shortly. Again, please do keep them coming in because we do have time in the session for questions. But before we get to those, I would like to hear Ben's thoughts from Asana's point of view about how workers feel about remote and flexible working. Ben.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Ben, as Richard said. I was really pleased to be invited to talk with you today because my wife actually works for the HSE, which is the Irish equivalent of the NHS. So I've seen firsthand the challenges that the public sector have had, certainly in terms of uniting technology, culture and processes as we've shifted towards this new normal post the pandemic. I've also seen her frustration at the lack of clarity in terms of the flexibility, the flexible working options, which has really made her think about the sustainability of it all. So her commute, the school runs, which to be clear, we do share, and all the other things that come from being tied to the traditional office. So that's something that we can talk a little bit more about today. And before I get into that, just to clarify and to remind you, Asana is a cloud-based work management tool that's used by organizations to communicate and collaborate and get clarity. So think of one tool where your tasks, your spreadsheets, your projects, your email, your messaging all live. So one unified source where the work happens. So that's why we're pretty obsessed about how people work and about the changes in future working practices. And I want to share some of the stats and the reports that we commissioned specifically on the topic of hybrid work today. So getting into that, as we all know, and I don't want to talk about the pandemic too much, but it has had an unintentional effect by redefining how employees prefer to work, right? And also how they value their working environment. So looking back historically, working from home was associated with perhaps reduced productivity, but that's completely different now. 77% of people who work remotely, even if it's a few times a month or a week, actually show increased productivity. with 30% doing more work in less time and 24% doing more work in the same period, which is actually quite surprising. And in fact, some ways it's going too far the other end, where people are just putting in more hours because they're at home and don't have the distractions. So you've got to find that balance. But that being said, for employers and managers, the concept of hybrid or distributed work isn't without challenges, as I'm sure we all appreciate. So it does allow us to tap into a broader pool of talent because we're not reliant on one location in one city. And it can reduce the cost of real estate and workplace operations, but it does demand more flexibility. And it can potentially limit the collaborative opportunities that come from working face to face, especially if the right tools aren't in place. So the questions this throws up that we're going to look at is, what's the biggest barrier to maintaining, or better still, increasing productivity if you move to a hybrid or a distributed workforce? What are the challenges you might face in terms of uniting technology or culture or processes as you shift to that new normal? And culture is really important. I know one of the people on the call talked about earlier as well. And then lastly, how are you reshaping your workplace strategy with retention of staff in mind? And that's becoming really relevant as well at the moment. A lot of this is about empowering individuals and empowering teams to give them the ability to know that they can have an impact within the organization, but rejecting a trade-off that it's all about impact and all about productivity, because actually it's also a lot about well-being and about retention and making sure people are happy with what they're doing. And this is really key and really pertinent, because our latest Anatomy of Work survey brought up some pretty alarming statistics around burnout. And unfortunately, almost 1 in 4 of you on this call today will have experienced burnout this year, probably more than once. And even worse, half of you think it's probably an inevitable part of today's workplace. And that's just pretty unsustainable. It's an unsustainable mindset that's going to lead to an unhealthy working pattern and unhealthy organizations. Compounded with that, the stats show that half of the people on the call and half the workplace are also suffering from both burnout and what we call imposter syndrome. And a lot of this has come out of the back of the pandemic. And this disproportionately affects younger workers as well. Now, imposter syndrome is a whole different topic, but it's really worth looking into, because that can be exacerbated by constant Zoom calls where you feel you can't contribute because it's not your vibe, it's not your comfort zone, but also by people not feeling connected to the organization's mission, or not feeling that they've got clarity over the impact their work really has across the organization. So to enable all these workers to put their best foot forward, all those issues have got to be tackled. And the research tells us that by showing every worker that their tasks, their goals contribute to the bigger organization's mission, people are really engaged, they feel more aligned, and get an idea of the purpose of their work, regardless of whether they're in the office or working from home or in a satellite office that you set up. So moving on from that, talking of lack of engagement, it's also directly linked to the age-old problem of breaking down silos within an organization. And the more hybrid you go, the more those silos can become problematic. So spending time navigating silos and figuring out what's happening means there's more of a disconnect between the hours you're working and the actual productive hours that you're spending. And it can, snowball into a bigger problem. And our latest data shows that you and your teams are spending on average 58% of your time, that's 58% of your time, on what we call work about work. And work about work is activities such as communicating about work, searching for information, switching between applications to get data and find out what's happening, shifting priorities, and chasing for status updates, like who's doing what and by when. And this is all work that we spend too much time doing, and it doesn't move the dial, and it certainly doesn't motivate us either. So we've got to tackle that, and that will lead to a more engaged workforce. And the more engaged workforce is statistically more productive and happier. And we know that in reality, most employees want to do more than just turn up to work. They want to make a difference and feel really connected. And this is none more relevant than in the public sector. And I know that because my wife is incredibly passionate about what she does. It's a vocation, and that's quite a rare thing, but she still wants to be connected. She wants to know, why is it so inflexible in terms of where I can operate, how I can do my thing. Can I get hold of a laptop to work from home because I've got an important thing that I can't get home in time for because of my commute? There's a whole load of real world issues that are coming to the fore now since pandemic. Another real life example of how a user of ours, an NHS trust, actually achieved this. And I love this story because it all started with one leader who had a vision to make things better for their team and better for their individuals because they were spending too much time on this work about work. And there's a lot to this story, but here are the headlines. So they needed to get control and clarity over their team, figure out who was doing what by when, and making sure people weren't working too hard and on the wrong things. And they wanted to move away from spreadsheets to manage all of that and figure out, what's happening in the different areas. They were two disparate trusts who needed to work together. So getting that clarity was even more important because they weren't even in the same location. And of course they did it, but the way they did it was by first sitting down and figuring out, what does success look like? Is that a cultural thing? Is it a productivity thing? Is it just achieving our mission? And then they embraced the fact that they are hybrid and they need to be hybrid, and then they found solutions for it. And obviously, that's what we're all here for today, is to help share some of those solutions and advice. So in summary, we're starting to see this great reshuffle, right, which is putting a lot of pressure on organizations. And that's because about 60% of workers are talking about changing jobs or getting itchy feet because they want to have more flexibility. And a Gartner survey also found that 65% of employees found that the pandemic made them really rethink the place that work has in their life. So that's a real call to action for all of us and for all the leaders out there. In order to thrive, we need to rethink how employees and their work interacts with each other. And that means seriously considering the benefits of hybrid or satellite work to get to that means to aid retention and improve a culture. And we know that it will enable you to tap into a broader talent pool. It will reduce that cost of real estate and workplace ops potentially, but it does demand really careful thought and planning. And the data tells us by having the right tools in place, by implementing the right culture things, which was really interesting how an office place was put in place with these cool, hybrid working spaces, but people weren't using them because they didn't know how to. But putting all that together does take a bit of time, but doing it will fuel creativity, it will fuel collaboration, and it will get people really engaged and enhance the culture and the productivity of our organizations. So the new normal's here, and the question really is, are we ready for it? Thank you.
And just to build exactly off that last point about the new normal, we are having a lot of questions in, so I'm going to move straight to those shortly. But I did just want to kind of look forward a little bit and ask kind of Meredith and Natasha in the first instance. We've heard new normal quite a lot, but we've also heard that there's pilots and lots of different things being tried at the moment. Do you think we'll ever end up in a sort of steady state again, where everybody works in the office on a kind of set pattern, or that at least it is predictable, or is there going to be kind of much more flexibility, and organizations will need to be much more nimble in what they kind of want from their estate from now for kind of forever? I'll ask Meredith that in the first instance, and then Natasha and anyone else who wants to jump in.
Start with a difficult question. I mean, we will have to, I think, get to a steady state, but that steady state might be very different from what we think it will be now. So, as I said, we are looking at going further in our plans to right-size our estate. They are probably quite conservative if you went as radical as some of the private sector would go about having flexibility. I think part of what we need to do, and I think Natasha started to talk about it actually, was around the right place and the right task, and making sure that people are doing things in the right location. There's still a really big shift, and whilst we have very large public estates which are paid for by the taxpayer, there will be a drive to ensure that people are working and using those spaces. What I think we need to do as we move forward, and what I think we'll see, is what activity is best placed, and it links to what Ben was saying as well. What will work best in an office location, and how do we ensure that those tasks always happen in an office location and they are fitted out to do that, and other tasks happen elsewhere? So I think we will get to a steady state at some point, but I think it's quite a long way off, and I think it will look quite different to what we are trialing today.
Mm-hmm. Natasha, what do you think?
Yeah, so just building on that, the exploration around matching task to space is the work that we're doing in HMRC to get us to a deeper understanding. So what we've acknowledged is that we don't yet have the evidence base that tells us as much as we would want to know to make decisions that are much more that we feel we could in some way future-proof in some way. And so we are really wanting to, well, we've needed to see how our colleagues were going to kind of respond to the expectations around return to the office. And whilst we've had some resistance, as I described earlier, by and large, the connection that people feel when they are in offices working together on things that make a difference for our customers really outweighs what we certainly saw through the pandemic with people working very long hours. So, you know, Ben, I was kind of sitting here nodding around the burnout. So actually, it's productivity. It's really getting under the skin of what we really mean and want out of productivity, out of that kind of phrase of productivity, because actually we can have people working relentlessly, but actually not delivering the type of quality outcomes we actually want for our customers, and actually not creating the best experiences for them. So we really want to get into actually what are the types of activities that we think our colleagues will really benefit from when they come together in our offices, and not be completely directed by you know, this kind of hard measure of, well, actually, how many emails have you got through in that particular day? Actually, it's about the social interactions that we know really benefit us in organisations as well.
And Ben, do you want to comment on that point as
well? I agree. And the thing is, we're humans, right? There's a statistic. I'm not the stat man, by the way, but there is a thing that if people haven't seen each other in the flesh for more than 18 months, then trust goes through the floor. So we like to eyeball each other. When we're together, that's when magic happens, right? But it doesn't have to be 5 days a week. And you know, we also need that time where we can focus and attend to a task and get through stuff. And that's where I think people are now thinking, I loved that during the pandemic because I was at home able to really focus. But actually, I miss the ability to be creative and collaborate and create stuff with people. So it's finding that balance. There's no cookie cutter. It depends on what you do and what department you're in. As I say, my wife works in a hospital. We couldn't ask the nurses to work from home because they'd have to bring the patients with them. That's madness. But she potentially could, because she can have meetings with patients and meetings with families and then be at home a day a week. You know, there's ways to make it work. And I think we just have to be flexible to get the best outcome, exactly as Natasha and Meredith said.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, to kind of tie this in, if I can, with the One Public Estate comments that you were making at the start, is there a new normal for that project as well? Because obviously it was, at least in part, about bringing together organisations and possibly unlocking collaboration benefits that weren't there previously. Is that having to adjust its thinking as everybody else is?
Yeah, I certainly agree that we're at a stage where we still need to understand better about what that future operating model looks like. And from an OPE perspective, that means that certain decisions won't get taken yet. I don't think you get too many disposals of property on the basis that people aren't, you know, there's lower utilisation. There's starting to be discussions around using property in a different way, and understanding the different reasons for property as well. So for example, from a local authority perspective, you're also looking at a kind of a place shaping role. What is the role of that property? So local authorities might be looking at maybe bringing using some of the space for kind of startup kind of businesses, a bit more of a regeneration role, as well as just understanding the needs of their own workforce. So I think For OPE, it's definitely time to look and understand different operating models. Probably not making the biggest decision yet. More leasing rather than disposing, just until you're sure what that model looks like.
And I'm going to move into questions now that have been submitted by people watching along. I was going to say at home, but wherever they are working, indeed, as is the topic of this webinar. I'm going to combine these first two, which is first one's from Jane Smith saying our public sector policy states no contribution to energy costs will be paid to home workers. Have other organisations considered contributing to this due to the great increase in fuel costs? And I think the second question is perhaps the flip side of that. How do you incentivise people to come into the estate? How do you create interventions to offer opportunities to connect and engage in person? I mean, is it too glib, Meredith, to say that one of the ways you incentivise people to come into the office is that they don't have to have their radiators on in the winter months?
Well, it's definitely something we've considered when we've been looking at sort of the ratios and how many people we're pointing towards a site, that actually in winter people may choose to come into the office because it will be cheaper to be in the office than it is to stay at home and put the radiator on. That has then been offset by people saying but travel costs and childcare and various other things may offset, but we genuinely don't know, and it's definitely something we've considered and thought about. And it's an interesting one. I think there has been some policies across government for bits of expenses, but yeah, again, we're working. It's not something that's quite caught up with the way that we're working yet, I don't think. And I think in terms of actually incentivizing people to come to the office, again, it was something Natasha talked about, which I think will probably be key, which is about creating actually that relationships and communities, because that's one of the things that's really hard in a hybrid way to create. People used to come into the office, see the same people every day, go out for lunch together, maybe go out after work together. You know, you had a lot of friends who you knew from work, who you socialized with around the working day. But if people are coming and going at different times, that is something else that's not come back. So creating communities, which is very different to the energy side of things. But I think in terms of incentivizing things to come back in the office, as we're not the private sector who can give everyone cakes and biscuits every day, we have to use our people and the pull to get people together. And I think that'll probably be key. But energy wise, watch this space. It's definitely a hot topic, I think.
Natasha, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I've had the pleasure in my last job before this one of visiting the HMRC hub in Croydon, and it was very striking how much effort was being put into building the community in that office, which at that time was being staffed up by people who were moving from other offices, and there was a great effort to create that community. Is that kind of a key thing that HMRC as an organisation is keen to maintain, and is it recognising that that's best done in person?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we have asked all of our leaders across the organisation as we were coming back to offices and as we are continuing on this journey is to think about the multitude of ways we can bring people together in ways, of course, that adds value, but also that reminds people of the social connection and the value that they get by actually coming together and doing work together. So there've been lots of virtual team events that have been happening for the last couple of years. There's nothing like bringing a team of 20 people together in a room and getting that kind of natural those natural interactions, those natural kind of bouncing off moments that happen. As somebody else described earlier, we haven't been able to recreate the water cooler moments, and we haven't been able to create those some of those deeper relationships that we know are built when people have the opportunity to socially connect. So we've, as I said, we've encouraged particularly our senior leaders around some of this, but actually we're also getting in each of our regional centres, we have regional leadership boards, and so they're a cross section of people from across the organisation who are all looking at how we best bring our strategic objective about being a great place to work to life. And there are various strands to that. So that we'll be thinking about, as I said, some of the outreach work that we can do in our communities, as well as the things that we want to do to enhance the experiences and the career opportunities of colleagues within the organisation. And so being really focused on and giving those regional leadership teams the empowerment to really work out where are the opportunities to bring people together in their region has been really critical for us, and we continue to drive that forward. And we will absolutely see, I think we will see, well, we've already seen actually, since after the summer break, where lots of people will have had chunks of time off, predominantly around kind of childcare, etc. But we've already seen a real uptick in people returning to offices in September, more so than what we were seeing as we were coming towards the summer. So we're feeling really encouraged actually about when people do come together and they are being connected, that actually they are seeing that value in coming back into offices week on week out.
I think I'll put this to Meredith, because I think you raised it. Forgive me if I'm misremembering in your comments. So kind of to turn it back to you as a question about, interested to hear any thoughts on smoothing the week and how on estate services can adapt their provisions to peaks and troughs. I mean, I think you set out the challenge. Any ideas on how to solve it yet?
Yeah, well, if I could create an app, I've got an idea for a building traffic light system that you book into a building and it tells you if it's going to be green, amber or red, to so you don't set off on a journey if you're not going to be able to get into the space. There will have to be some work around occupancy management as we start to get to ratios where literally if everybody turns up, they won't physically fit in or health and safety wouldn't provide. It's a really tricky one without trying to be prescriptive, which we're all trying not to be. We don't want to be turning around to teams of people and saying, well, you come on Monday, you come on Tuesday, you come on Wednesday. At the moment, it's not at levels with people returning that we've had major issues yet, but I can see it coming. Similarly, we're definitely starting to see more people in buildings. So how we manage that occupancy will be key. We know, there's lots of things available on the market. I was actually speaking with Colin Cassie at HMRC around some of the trials they've been doing on occupancy management and comparing some of the things we've been doing around desk booking tools and things, and saying how can we come together and how are we comparing notes on what works. So there's lots out there that people, again, are trialing. But again, it's trying to do something that keeps the flexibility people want in this hybrid way, therefore the advantage, with a little bit of organisation so that we are able to smooth it. But I think if you want a desk, go Monday and Friday at the moment, and you'll be okay in most places.
Natasha, any thoughts on HMRC's side on how you do that?
I was nodding away. So there've been some really interesting localized efforts actually around. So local teams are saying, okay, guys, look, we know we've got the full span of Monday to Friday. How are we locally going to ensure that the right people who need to come together have the opportunity to do so, and let's use the full breadth of the week. So there've been different types of systems that people have created locally, and managers are kind of sharing wider. So those are some, as I said, some practical things that people are thinking about in terms of how they best support teams to work most effectively in that space. Again, we've explored, and Meredith, you touched on this already, having connected with HMRC, but we've started to explore things like booking tools. So, how might we give colleagues kind of access to information about, what spaces are available, but how do we do that in a way that isn't just about desk space? So desk booking was where we started some time ago. And actually, we're much more moving into the space that says, well, actually, how do we ensure that all of the available spaces actually are made known to colleagues? But also within that, how do we ensure that we've got the right types of spaces, as I talked about before, in terms of matching task to space, so that, because those two things need to come together. It's about the type of space that's available, as well as making sure that we can smooth attendance. And then the third thing for me is actually around the work that we know we need to continue to do, the cultural shift around smarter working more broadly. So part of the challenge we have, we were just talking about it earlier today, actually, as part of the regional leadership board in this area, around how colleagues understand the various spaces that are available. So we have lots of opportunity for colleagues to work in a multitude of spaces, but there is a kind of smaller allocation of quiet spaces, and it's really easy for people to levitate to those spaces and kind of stick to them all day. So how do we get people using spaces in a much more flexible way, so that when those colleagues who actually need to come in to do a considerative piece of work on a Thursday afternoon actually have got access to that type of space that they need. But yeah, it remains a challenge, right, to smooth that attendance when actually you've overlaid in that same kind of challenge is, of course, the working patterns we already had established before we were moving into the pandemic. So we know that there's more for us to think about as an organisation in terms of actually how do we balance our week in a way that where we do our work throughout the course of the week enables people to also smooth attendance as well.
And Michael, I want to come to you to get a kind of thought about what you mentioned in your opening comments about how the public sector estate can help things like town centre regeneration and things like that. I think we've heard quite a lot today about this still being a little bit up in the air in departments, perhaps not knowing what their estate will be like a few years hence, and where the steady state will be if we reach a steady state at any point. What do you think from a local partnerships perspective departments should be thinking about in terms of the wider impact of any decisions to move from offices or kind of move into hubs and things like that? What is there kind of opportunities and threats from how the public sector goes about this?
Yeah, I think exactly that. There are challenges, particularly when you've got smaller towns, smaller centres that did have large public sector offices that maybe have in recent years, closed down. I know one of the challenges we had with the early years of One Public Estate was where the development of these new public sector hubs quite often meant that smaller offices in maybe particularly North and Midlands or the areas I worked in, you might have staff moving and going to a larger hub. So there's a challenge there for those local towns, and I suppose they're the towns that I do a lot of work with, particularly in the North and Midlands, where there are public sector buildings. That makes most sense, I think, for those organisations to collaborate, to understand their kind of the operating model, understand from a government department perspective, are there is a certain type of office space that might be more beneficial? What can you do to retain those staff? Because obviously that's especially in some of these smaller towns, that's a major element of footfall in terms of regeneration and retail and shopping. From a department perspective, and I know from an OP perspective, this is something we encouraged, and Natasha and Meredith will I'm sure say that this does happen, is the communication with local leaders, local authorities, where there are potential disposals, offices closing, or again in looking from a levelling up perspective at new opportunities. And obviously the levelling up white paper was really clear, didn't it, that this kind of shift from London to the regions, there's a huge opportunity there, and that opportunity is most felt, I think, in some of the towns that are struggling, and that footfall can just help to kind of create the interest that brings in the smaller retail organisations that a lot of the levelling up applications, and we're looking at some of those supporting DLUP at the moment, are based on. So yeah, it's more than anything, there's a communication and that collaboration element. But again, coming back to Meredith and Natasha, they'll have their own priorities. And this is as there's a question in the chat, isn't there, around the challenges, I think, around lots of government departments with their own priorities, and then what's the OPE angle, and there are tensions there. There's no doubt, because if you need to raise X amount of money by selling property, or you need to move a certain number of people, you can't always wait for the slower moving organisations, and the OPE sometimes does do that. So it is about that kind of negotiation, that discussion.
And we've had a question here that I'll put to Ben from Anna L. Can you speak to the link between digital transformation and flexible work? For example, is the rise of flexible work unlocking new opportunities? I'm sure other people have a thought on that. But Ben,
that's
first.
to me, because I'm the software geek, right? Is that what you're trying to say? I won't take offense. So look, to demystify digital transformation, because I feel like I hear that phrase as much as I heard Brexit and Y2K back in the day. That shows my age. Basically, I look at digital transformation like driving an old manual diesel car that every now and again you have to pull over and fill it up, and you're changing the gears manually and off you go, compared to like a swanky Tesla, which is all electric and automatic and does lots of cool things. If you can make it make rude noises if you change the indicator. And I only know that because I was in a Tesla taxi, and much to my 7-year-old's delight, that the taxi driver turned on this very rude noise whenever he indicated. In digital transformation is very similar, right? It's about how we can look at our business processes and move away from manual, paper-based things that stop you from working really smoothly. So I'm able to click a few buttons in a task and create some work or an action for someone who's based in London or Germany or San Francisco, because we've got tools in place that have automations and workflows, and it's not paper-based and it's not manual. And that's what it's all about, really. So absolutely, you can't have flexible work and have people working from home or in satellite offices and disconnected if you haven't got some kind of systems and tools and automations in place to make the processes flow, because you can't walk over to a photocopier or to a filing cabinet if you're in Bath and that filing cabinet happens to be in London. So it's crucial that a big part of the hybrid movement is, can people still operate as effectively? Can they still communicate? Can they still collaborate? And what tools have we got in place to make that happen? So yeah, it's the two are completely intrinsically linked. And that's why digital transformation is so hot right now, because it's a big thing to make this whole thing fly.
Mm-hmm. I'll extend that question to the rest of the panel, and perhaps any closing thoughts as well, because we're nearing the end of the session. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'll go to Natasha first, because I know that HMRC's transformation was had underlying digital transformation elements as well, particularly kind of hardware stuff, making sure that staff had all the technology that they needed. And as I said, that my visit to a hub was before the pandemic. So did that all stand up kind of as maybe not envisioned a global pandemic, but as you thought it might do when the crisis struck? And where is the kind of digital element of the transformation now?
Yeah, so it stood us in really good stead, actually, Richard, for being able to effectively flip an organisation from one that was, predominantly working in offices, as Meredith described, 5 days a week, to one where the majority of the workforce, we had a small percentage of our workforce who needed to continue to come in, but actually all of our colleagues had the equipment to enable them to work from home. So they all had either Surface Pros or Elite Books, so they were able to kind of continue with their work. But not only that, we had introduced pieces of technology over the course of the kind of preceding couple of years that enabled us actually to continue to collaborate, not in the ways that we had been traditionally used to, but continue to collaborate. And we'd already started to work on we'd already started to develop the kind of digital skills across the organisation. Now, again, there's a way for us still to go. And the point that I wanted to make actually is one where, as an organisation, we have been minded to not make too many assumptions around how fast we have progressed and transformed as an organisation. So colleagues have absolutely grasped and really excelled in so many ways, actually, with the transition. You know, we we had to pivot as an organisation the type of work that we were doing. So we went from collecting taxes to actually having to pay out in new schemes that we couldn't have imagined at that point in time. And we had colleagues doing that from all sorts of weird and wonderful kind of home circumstances. But the technology enabled colleagues to be able to still collaborate, to be able to do that. What we know, though, we've just recently undertaken a digital skills survey across the organisation, is we have still got some significant gaps in terms of kind of capability across a range of different digital tools. Actually, awareness is quite low of some of the digital tools that we have got available. And so what we're bringing together now as we keep pressing forward with our kind of ambition, as I described earlier, around smarter working, which really looks at 4 really clear tenets. So actually, as we're thinking about evolving our culture, we're also thinking about the technology. We're thinking about the leadership that goes with that. So the work that we're doing at the minute now is what's the underlying digital capability we need to help us to not just continue to operate as we are now, but help us to excel in the future.
Clear in the pandemic, the impact that digital service transformation had in what the DWP was able to deliver around universal credit and a lot of extra claims being processed. Is the kind of digital transformation forming part of your estate's plan as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think we did about 3 years worth of the plan in about a month or something during the pandemic. It was astronomical, the change, and similar to Natasha now, you know, yeah, pretty much everyone has a device that they can work from home. Everyone has access to various online platforms to interact with people in different locations. I think when we first met before this call, I said this is the first time as a DWP colleague I've been able to get on Zoom. Some of it is about the things that you don't see behind the scenes, and some of the firewalls, the security, you know, that in itself is a transformation around what you're able to do. Some of the policy changes that the department will have, so actually people being able to have a face-to-face interaction with a member of the public over a device. These are things that are sort of trial but not widely used at the moment. So I think these things will continue and definitely have to be factored in, and are things we have to make sure our workspaces have the ability to link in. So, you know, meeting rooms that are equipped that you can link into Teams calls or other digital platform calls, areas that you can have multiple docking stations, just ways that people are able to work as effectively. And it absolutely has to go together in that transformation moving forward as we go hybrid, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, any thoughts on the kind of digital transformation element from local partnerships point of view? How do you account for that in the kind of One Public Estate planning and thinking going forward?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? So had we been 2 or 3 years with COVID going back, we would have been ready to pick up and to respond the way we did. So it's the timing, if you like, as a few people said, you know, probably it brought forward the technology that we're all using now by 10, 15 years. The only thing I'd say, and sorry to kind of finish on a kind of a slight kind of negative or pause, is we just need to make sure with digital that A, we're not excluding people, B, and I sit on a board for a housing association, that we're aware of issues around data security, of kind of digital kind of risks of fraud, of cyber kind of crime, and make sure that the race that we've had over the last couple of years to get everything in place doesn't expose organisations to risk. So it's probably a good time to just review as we think forward to the digital future, that we're on solid foundations.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just give Ben a chance to make some closing comments on probably on that point. How do we make sure these foundations are solid?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're working with a reputable vendor, if they're registered on the G Cloud, then you're covered, because there's intense security that we have to go through, and the way that the software is hosted and all the regulations. So I worry less about that because I see the inner workings and I see the amount of investment and time that it takes for a reputable software company to be able to manage and store and process data really well. I just come back to the fact that, you know, change is difficult and change can be quite hard for people, and taking people from point A to point B without explaining like why we're doing it, what the end goal is, what the benefit's going to be, what the value is going to be, that's where mistakes can happen. So whether it's moving people from a central location to a hybrid location, or allowing them to work from home, or going through a digital transformation process, ultimately it's all about change, and we're humans and we find change unsettling. So as leaders, as people running teams, that's the thing to always think about, is how can we manage this change best? How can we give people clarity? How can we make sure their expectations are managed? And you always get a better outcome if you look at it from that way, rather than racing to the end result with kind of without bringing people along with you.
Very good thought, I think, to bring the session to a close. Now I'm going to have to do that. I think that's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks very much to all of our panel for joining us today, and to everybody watching along, particularly as I know, as Meredith raised, the occasional difficulties that people have for accessing Zoom. So thank you very much for joining us, and thanks to Asana very much for joining today as the knowledge partner. You will be receiving a recording of this session when it is available in the next few days, and also a report in the next couple of weeks as well, pulling out some of the key points of this conversation. Before that, though, there'll be a survey that should be in your inbox now to get your thoughts on today's webinar, and it would really help me and the team here at Global Government Forum. If you could complete that, it would help us make sure we're providing the best possible content for you all, and any ideas on topics you would like to cover in future webinars would also be welcome. That would make my job a lot easier. I also want to flag this is the part of a series of webinars on cross-public sector collaboration that we are running. The next one is on shared services and how to make them work in the public sector on the 6th of October, and it'd be really great to see you at that. Another one of interest is the one you can see on the slide, which is next week on Getting Real, how real-time data can help improve government services, which is taking place on the 29th of September. And you can see the full list of Global Government Forum webinars on our website, globalgovernmentforum.com. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us today, and we hope to see you at another one of our webinars soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.